Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This is, I think, episode number 24, Matt. Mm-hmm. So we're on a bit of a roll. We're sticking to our promises in terms of recording things on a regular basis. So exciting. We've got a couple of good topics to get into today, a couple of really good questions from listeners. And I guess before we start, and before we have a chat about what's gone on the last couple of weeks, the first thing that I want to say to all of the listeners really is, number one, you would have seen that we are recording this now. There's a lot of stuff going on our Instagram. So our Instagram page, TorFitGolf59, give us a follow. Also, we're going to be putting these out on YouTube as well. So anybody that likes the podcast, we'd appreciate you to subscribe, even just make some comments, some likes on the YouTube channel. It'd be very, very much appreciated. And if nothing else, give us a little thumbs up or a 5-star review or whatever review you think that the podcast is worth. So enough of the housekeeping, Matt. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very, very good. I'm feeling sharp this morning.
Great.
I had a good training session last night.
Pardon?
Sore? No, not too bad. Not too bad. I'd done about an hour and a half last night, and it was very, very, very good. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. What have you been up to?
Yeah, I've the weather's been nice. Been out playing some golf over the last couple of weeks, which has been great. Feels like it's starting to change now. We're starting to hit spring a little bit. Been back in the gym as well a little bit, which is nice.
Good.
Starting to do some training again, so feeling it as well.
How's the game coming on?
Good. Yeah, good. It's taking over. Like I said, the winter's a long period of non-playing, but that's when you sort of sharpen your tools, and with the use of like TrackMan Studios, and we've got access to it, so it keeps going. But it's all right. It's all right. Could be better. Could be worse.
Yeah, I actually very much look forward to getting on a golf course, and I'm tempted to actually go out and play a couple of holes this afternoon if I got time. I've literally not been on a golf course since August last year, which is like really embarrassing, because there was a day or a time rather, where I'd play or hit the ball, every day pretty much. I'd go 2 days without playing golf, and I'd feel like, oh my God, starting again. But now it's like months, and I've got to do better than that, because I love playing golf. I even just love kind of like the equipment side, and just trying like different wedges, different clubs, different drivers, different fairway woods, and I find that quite fun as well. So I've got to find a way of maybe not playing 18 holes kind of like on a regular basis, but even just doing 3, 4, 5 holes, even first thing in the morning, just to get going. But for me, I think I don't get going really until the Masters starts.
Sure.
Or at least until it starts to rumble about the Masters. And, you mentioned it before we started recording. I think we'll do an episode on the Masters.
Absolutely.
And not just the Masters coming up and who we think is going to win and do well, but also we can talk about, my experience going to the Masters last year, which was unbelievable. And I've got loads and loads of things that I'd like to kind of to talk about on that.
Yeah.
So again, if anybody's got any questions, fire them in relative to the Masters. So I thought we might as well just get kind of straight into it today. The topic I want to talk about more than anything, which is relevant to the time of year, is about wedges. We get a lot of questions, in the shop, in the studio. How often should we change our wedges? What wedges should I be using? And I thought it'd be really good just to kind of, break some of that information down, put it into really kind of like bite-sized information for players. So if they're thinking about changing wedges, they might be thinking about changing the model, the bounce, the grind. They might just be looking for a fresh set of wedges. I mean, we done a fresh set for someone last week, I think. Stamped them up nicely and got them out to him. So that was really nice. But I think it's worth giving some structure really around kind of like how, why, when, what the players should be doing. So first of all, Matt, right, give the listeners a bit of an idea. When it comes to a wedge fitting, what does that whole experience and what does a wedge fitting look like compared to maybe like a driver fitting?
Sure.
Where, driver fitting, you'd come into the studio, you're testing different heads, different shafts, you're looking at the numbers. How does that differ really for a wedge fitting?
Sure. I mean, so in terms of the actual head itself, a lot of these specialty wedges now are, in terms of actual profile, they're all very similar. There's not much going on in terms of the actual design of these heads. So it's more about what's going on internally. So stuff like bounce, stuff like grind options. They've got all the manufacturers have got a bunch of different options in that front. Not all the same. So Titleist can have different bounce options to Callaway, and then we're starting to see new ones come through, which is great. So there's array of testing to be done. And from a fitting perspective as well, with the Wedge, you've got some full swing stuff, you've got some bunker stuff, some more, some pitching, some chipping. So there's an array of different shots to be tested with it. And I think if you can really, and especially somewhere like we are, we've got the facilities to do both. So we've got the TrackMan to look at some full swing stuff, to look at some delivery stuff, and then we can potentially nip down to the short game area and then look at some bunker and greenside stuff. So there's more compared to a driver. It's a good question.
There's definitely more things that you've got to look at, because there's more variables, and definitely against a driver, it's not a static environment. But typically the ball is played off the tee all the time. You're generally playing off a flat surface, depending on the golf course you're playing on, and most of the time you're trying to hit the ball an optimal distance. So the actual task, I think, for a driver fit in is fairly static. You wouldn't be looking at a huge amount, much more than that. Yes, there's some shot shaping. You might want to look at some shots that you play under pressure. But the wedge fit in is far more dynamic. I think when you look from player to player, everybody has got different skill sets with wedges. Everybody has got different ideas of how to play shots, and it's not like one idea is the best. Nope. Like some players would be really good at flop shots, some players are really good at bump and runs, depending on where you've grown up and what courses you've played on. So there's lots of things to unpack, and I often find, and you can chime in on this if you think that I'm wrong here, I often find that in a wedge fit in, I probably talk more at the start of the session and really trying to understand what a player does and how they use the wedges and what types of shots they play and where they play, and is there a variety of surfaces they play on. And through that conversation, I feel like for a wedge fitting in particular, I can get to a point where I've ruled out a huge amount of options before we even start, just through conversation. And I know that might sound a little bit kind of weak because there's no data behind it. But if somebody says that they use their 60-degree lob wedge all the time, as an example, and they open the face, and they always use it in a bunker, the chances are that you're not going to be going into a 60-degree wedge with a huge amount of bounce, or a profile with the sole which is really wide. So like already there, you need something with a little bit of forgiveness in it. You need something which is probably going to have a bit more relief around the heel and the toe. So just from a Vokey standpoint, you're probably looking already at an M, an S, an L, a T. The L actually is not, it's no longer in the, I always say L, but it's more T. Potentially even a V, for anybody who knows any of the wedge work V grinds. So I feel like, there's a lot more conversation that goes on with the wedge fitting, and then on the back of that, then there's a lot more testing. I actually really enjoy fitting wedges because I think when you get to a half decent standard, and I'm talking like handicap between probably 20 and 8, I would say, where you're playing on a regular basis, you can navigate your way around the golf course really well, performance starts to become a little bit more important for you. I think the difference between having a good wedge, or a wedge that works, and a wedge that doesn't work, or helps you and hinders you, is probably the best way of putting it. It can have a dramatic effect on your game. And I've had that myself before, where, I've put wedges in, and TaylorMade probably won't enjoy me saying this, but when I was working for TaylorMade, I never really liked the wedges because there wasn't a huge amount of options, and I always used to grind the wedges, and you've probably seen some of my old wedges. They're all ground to bits, and it's not that eventually I got there, but I had to go through like a lot to kind of like grind these wedges, and I go, oh no, I need a little bit more play with it, I need a little bit more, and I had to work really hard to try and get those wedges correct, just because there was like a standard bounce option, a low bounce option, and typically like an ATV grind. They're great wedges and they're designed really, really well. Just the options for me personally in the higher lofts, not so much the lower lofts. The lower lofts are great. I had to work really hard to try and get those right. Whereas now, I mean, you've seen my wedges. I've got a T grind and I've got a V grind. Those two options, depending on the surfaces I'm playing, they're absolute gold for me, and I feel like I can work the face quite a lot. The V grind helps me when it's a bit softer.
Yeah.
And
the lovely wedge eyes.
Yeah, it is good, and you've done a great job on stamping that the other day as well. We'll have to put it on our Instagram stories for anybody that's interested. And thanks for doing that as well. That was really good. So yeah, like I'm saying, like conversation is really important. Understanding the player, understanding their capabilities, understanding the limits of how they use the wedge is really important. Talk to us a little bit about kind of gapping and some of the issues that we see now sometimes with stronger lofted kind of clubs.
Sure, 100%. So again, it is a common conversation with people in the studio. So you tend to find now some of these iron sets coming out, some of these more players distance irons. You see the pitching wedge getting closer to 40 degrees. As the years go on, they seem to be getting closer to that number. And there's only a few. I can think of a few off the top of my head of these manufacturers that make these specialty wedges. Vokey being one of them, where you've got the 46, you've got the 48.
Cut over you there.
Yeah.
Have you seen the new launch from Vokey?
44.
Yes. Literally just about to drop.
I did see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did look good.
And this is not a plug for Vokey or Titleist or anything, but
sure.
They've got a 44 degree wedge.
No, I did see it. I saw it this morning.
As soon as I seen that, I was like, that is going to be useful. That's going to be really useful for us.
Very, very, very. But it's like, yeah, so it's making that now, bridging that gap between the pitching wedge and that first wedge a little bit more tricky. So like, come back to Titleist T150 has been a great iron set. They do the 48 wedge within that set. That's been really popular. And again, it's, if you've got something like that, then it makes it a little bit easier, and you can play around with the loft and line machine. You can really dial in that yardage. If you need to find a bit more with that first specialty wedge, then great, you can. But it is getting harder now as these wedges, these iron sets are getting stronger, just to bridge that gap. But
do you find yourself kind of going maybe a little bit weaker? Sometimes 9 iron and pitching wedge. So as an example, going half a degree weaker with a 9, 1 degree weaker with a pitching wedge, and then using that gap wedge then, depending on what loft that is, to maybe nudge that up a little bit to squeeze the gap.
100%.
Yeah, that's been a popular one for me, that has, because obviously once you weaken the pitching wedge, you increasing the gap then between the pitching wedge and the 9. And I think that's really, really useful, and it's a really nice way to blend the wedges, because the difficulty is when you've got a strong lofted pitching wedge, and of course it like goes through the whole set from 9 iron down. It just makes the gap basically from your pitching wedge to whatever the shortest distance that you're going to pitch with. It just makes that whole distance greater, which means you've got the same amount of clubs to cover different distances. So it's going to mean one of two things: is you either need to put more wedges in, or you need to add more strings to your bow. And what I mean by that is you need to increase your skill level, and you need to be able to be more versatile with your wedges. And rather than just being able to hit one full wedge and then go down to the next wedge and hit that full, you might have to learn to create a pitching grid and know how far a 3/4 wedge goes. And when you grip down on it a little bit, how far does that go? And if you turn the wedge in a little bit and try and draw it, can you get an extra 4 or 5 yards out of it? So I think that's a really good concept for players as well. Is yes, we're a fit-in podcast and a fit-in business, but I think you can't deny players are coming to us to improve their golf and get better handicaps, win competitions. We can't ignore the fact that you need to add some skills and some strings to your bow sometimes, and that is not going to hurt anybody.
No.
Being one-dimensional with your wedges and just hitting full shots is okay. But there's a huge amount more to it.
Absolutely.
There's a huge amount more to it. And the top players put a lot of time into controlling their wedges. And if their pitching wedge goes 130 yards, they need to make sure that from 130, let's just call it down to 50, they've got all of those yardages covered, because you don't know like when you're going to have 55 or 65 or 75 or 85 or whatever it is. So you need to have that covered. So I think that's a good piece of advice as well.
And even from a yardage perspective, even from like a launch and spin perspective, isn't
Exactly.
it? If you've got something where you've got conditions wise, you need to take a little bit of spin off it. Hitting that shot that just will allow you to do that is just going to again just add in clubs or shots to your arsenal.
Yeah, and if you can hit, like you say, if you can hit a 3/4 wedge, and you can do that with 3 wedges, I mean you've got 3 different trajectories there. So like playing in the wind, like you say, flighting the ball down, controlling the spin, great, like really, really good. And I just think you'll become more versatile as a player, which is good.
100%.
One common topic that a lot of players ask us about. And it's a hot topic always when we're talking about wedges in the studio, spin. So, like, if somebody buys new wedges, are they going to get more spin?
Yeah.
Right, it's easy, isn't it? Right, and I'm gonna dig into this a little bit. So, is spin helpful?
Can be.
Okay, so unfold that a little bit and unpack that.
So are we talking specifically with wedges?
Yeah, so like if you're putting, let's just say you put in 3 new wedges in, you go 50, 54, 58 or 60.
Yeah.
Upgrading all of those, which on paper is going to give you more spin with all of them, is that going to be helpful or is it going to be a hindrance?
It's a good question.
Because I know how I feel when I put new wedges in.
Yeah.
And
so it's like you're constantly thinking, right, I need to make sure this doesn't. I don't know. There's a few ways you could go about this actually.
So let me tell you what I feel when I put a bunch of new wedges in. Right, I feel straight away with my higher lofted wedges, I gain straight away.
Yeah.
Right, I've got an instant improvement, and I've got more control over that golf ball when it makes contact with the surface. It spins more, it stops quicker, it can be a bit more aggressive. I feel like my margin for error goes up. However, then my 50 and the 54, I mean, I use the 50 and the 54 quite a lot for pitching, and I use it quite a lot for full shots as well. So that wears down quite a bit, to be fair. Because I'm dialed in on my yardages with those, when I start adding 5, 6, 7, 800 revolutions a spin, whatever it would be, I feel like it affects my distances quite a lot. So I've almost got to recalibrate my lofts a little bit, which is good, but it's annoying. So the benefits to it is like when I start playing on firm surfaces, I'm going to get a steeper land angle. The ball's going to stop a little bit quicker. It's great. However, I've got to recalibrate those yardages a little bit. Because for anybody that's listening here, what changes when you get new wedges is friction. And when you increase friction through having new wedges, sharper grooves, for anybody that's really had a look at the face of wedges, they've almost got these like micro grooves on the faces as well. Those micro grooves will increase friction, and it effectively just increases the amount of spin that you're going to get. It's almost like having sandpaper on the face. And over time, that sandpaper and those micro grooves wear down, and you get less spin, and the ball typically goes a little bit further. Now, to put this in context, from a full shot perspective, 300 full shots is where you start to see the spin degrading a little bit, right? Which, when you hear stories about Rory and some tour players changing their wedges every 2 or 3 weeks, you think then, well, actually, what they're trying to do is they're trying to keep that spin number the same, so they will change their wedges every time they hit 200 to 300 shots. Right, which is really sensible. And this is where I go wrong, right? Is because I want to hit 200 or 300 shots. I might hit 3,000 shots with my 50 or my 54 as an example. And the difference in spin then over time, it changes. So that's why for me personally, and I can probably relate to most of the listeners listening here, they're not going to change their wedges every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Sometimes that can happen. And going into new wedges sometimes can kind of ruffle a few feathers initially. But if you get somebody who can tweak lofts and to give you that information, they can almost tell you, if you're hitting your 50-degree wedge and you got a new one and it's spinning up another 500-600, they can tell you you're going to lose 4 or 5 yards initially. You're going to gain on stopping power. The land angle is going to be a bit steeper. So you either need to adjust for that, or we need to adjust the wedge a little bit, which is good information.
Yeah, very.
Now, I want to unpack spin just a little bit more. right? And this is going to get probably a little bit geeky, but I want people to understand, and all the listeners to understand, how spin's created. So spin is created from 4 things, right? It's created by the amount of loft you deliver. So that loft on a TrackMan or any launch monitor is often displayed as spin loft. So that is the amount of loft that you're actually delivering to the golf ball. And for anybody that wants to understand it a little bit more, is the difference between your attack angle and your dynamic loft. It's almost like a little wedge that you create going into the golf ball. So number 1, the bigger that is, generally, the more the ball is going to spin. However, when it starts going over a certain amount, you start to lose something else, which is called friction, right? So sometimes the bigger the loft, sometimes the ball doesn't spin as much. It just goes up in the air more and comes down steeper. So it stops quicker, but it doesn't necessarily stop quicker through spin. That is quite complicated and quite deep. A lot of people might have just gone, I'm going to listen to Radio 1 for 5 minutes when we're listening to that. But that's the truth, right? So we've got spin loft. The next one is strike. This is something which everybody can improve. You strike the ball better, the ball's going to spin more, right? So bottom line, get better at striking the golf ball. Third thing, any ideas? What changes spin? Speed.
Yep.
Okay, so the more speed that you've got, the more spin that you're going to impart on the golf ball, like basic physics, right? And then the third thing, which is where kind of like new equipment really, really comes into it, is friction. And in a way, it's the alignment of the CG of the club. So when you start looking at the design of golf clubs these days, and wedges especially, what they're trying to do, especially with the high lofted wedges, they're trying to drag the CG location up on the face, make the faces almost as rough as possible, make that sandpaper on the face as rough as they possibly can, and the grooves as sharp as they possibly can. So those 4 things are going to dictate the amount of spin and the amount of stopping power that you get with a wedge. Very, very important to understand. And like I say, when you start going over a certain amount of loft, the spin actually decreases, but the launch angle goes up and the land angle is steeper, which means it stops quicker. So if you were to hit a flop shot, as an example, the ball doesn't spin a lot on a flop shot. It just goes up in the air and it stops really quick. The same as if you were to hold a golf ball in your hand and just drop it, the ball doesn't roll anywhere, stops pretty much straight away. So the same would happen if you hold a golf ball in your hand and you dropped it, that golf ball is going to stop pretty much dead, and it's got no spin, like literally zero spin. So that's where kind of like stopping power comes from 2 things. It comes from spin and it comes from land angle. So hopefully that kind of like allows people to understand sometimes why wedges can be influential, because wedges change the friction. And obviously if you move from a 50-degree wedge to a 52, you're changing the spin loft, which will also change the spin. So sometimes you can look at spin and you can say, right, I need more spin. What do I need to do? You can either change the lofts, change the quality of the wedge in terms of how new it is, and also make sure you strike it better, which is important, which is really, really important. Talk to me about grooves, Matt. So if you've got a wedge, which obviously the face with those micro grooves that we're talking about, if they've slowly disappeared, they disappear quite quickly. And also the grooves start to change a little bit. How does that influence some of the golfers that would be listening to this?
So I think you've sort of touched on it already. In that last little bit is friction. So as those grooves start to wear down, essentially there's less friction between that golf ball and that club face. So in terms of generating those spin rates, it's naturally going to decrease.
Yeah, you're right. And generating spin rate is important with good grooves. The other side to this is also maintenance of spin. Yeah. Right. So the grooves play a much bigger part on maintaining spin than they do generating spin. You are right. They help generate spin without question. But the part that they play the most is maintaining spin. And what I mean by that is if you get any debris in between golf ball and golf club, grass, dirt, water, whatever it is, the bigger the area for that dirt, water, grass, whatever it is, to move into. So if that groove is bigger, the same as you tread on your tyres, the more you're going to maintain spin. If there's nothing there and the only thing that's in between the club and the ball is grass, water, or dirt, then that golf ball ain't going to spin. It ain't going to launch the same as it normally launches, and your distance and your outcome is going to be different. So if you were to test wedges, right, which have got no grooves on them, and wedges which have got grooves on them, there would be a little difference in spin. Not as much as what you would think, right? If then, excuse me, you sprayed a little bit of water on the golf ball, all of a sudden then the game is completely different. And my analogy is kind of like ball tyres versus brand new tyres.
Yeah.
You try braking, and the guy with ball tyres, especially when it's wet, is going to go absolutely flying and lose control very, very quickly. And it's the same with the golf ball. No grooves, no control when it's wet, especially. So very important when it comes to grooves. If you play in varied conditions and you play in, conditions where it's going to be wet, or you're playing on a rough, which is pretty much everyone, the grooves are going to have an influence, which is really important.
That's a good point. Excellent point.
We touched earlier, Matt, on stamping and lasering.
Yeah.
We've recently bought some stamps, which has been a lot of fun, isn't it?
Very, very. It's an art. It's a really it's a really tricky skill to sort of get, not master, but even get half good at it. It takes a lot of practice, and but it's going good.
Yeah,
really good.
It's enjoyable, isn't it, when you can start kind of like thinking about all the different designs. I mean, you done a nice one on my wedge the other day where you put a lot of stars on there, and you put my kids' names on it. And it was really good, and it adds like a little cool dimension to your wedges, doesn't it?
100%. It's just like that I did, just like hand done touch, isn't it? It's like it just goes along with the. No, it's cool. Yeah,
so we've now got stamping, we've got lasering. Lasering is very different to stamping. Like lasering is good. You can do a lot more intricate things with the laser, and you can get the letters a lot bigger and a lot cleaner. The stamping, I feel like, is quite raw, and it's got this really cool kind of like. I don't even know how to describe it really, but it's got this like workshop-y kind of like hand-built kind of feel to it, and look, of course. I think it's great.
It's just almost like no two are exactly the same, isn't it? It's like it's got each one is unique.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's done by hand, and we're having a lot of fun with it. So on that point, we've been going for a good few minutes here. I thought what we would do is play some of the questions. So we've got a couple of good questions, and again, anybody listening, fire them into us. Send us a WhatsApp, send us a voice note, do it on Instagram, whatever you think. This is what we love doing, is just answering your questions. So hopefully this is going to work straight away. Let me just double check that we are good to go on Roadcaster. We are good to go. So let's start with this question.
Hi Tom, thanks for the reply. John here from South Wales also. I'm a true handicapper, and my question sort of revolves around the gap between 4-iron and 3 wood. Over the years, trying and tinkering about using all the different 2-3 irons, hybrids, and recently some woods. My question to you is, how do these tour pros manage to keep 5, 7, and 9 woods in the bag, whilst also keeping spin rate really low and in a playable position? Whenever I've tried anything up from a 3 wood, the spin rate just seems to skyrocket, and I get these big air balls that come down with snow on them. So, yeah, looking forward to seeing what you think. Loving the pod. Cheers, mate.
Good question.
Really good question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and when I heard this question, I was like, this is going to be class to unpick. It's going to be really, really class to unpick, because I think there's 2 sides to this. One where 5 wood and 7 wood is just not going to work for some players. John might be in that category. Other players, it might be perfect. And the reason why I thought this was really good is because me and you are opposite sides of the table here.
Yeah.
And we've got very different perspectives on it. So before we dive into kind of like our kind of setup with our clubs, maybe talk about that question, Matt, and
Sure.
give John some
Yeah, 100%.
decent answers.
I think it's quite a hot topic at the minute as well, because you're starting to see now what's in the bags of a lot of these best players in the world. You're starting to see these now higher lofted woods. I think Ludwig has been a thing for it quite recently, playing I think he's got a 7 wood, and DJ as well, we spoke about with that 9 wood as well. So it's a good question, because they're getting a lot more popular. In terms of what you said, some people might not be suited to them at all, 100%. I think a lot of it, the first thing to look at is the club delivery. So what's happening with that golf club at impact? There's a lot of people, club golfers, both of us, sometimes we can deliver a little bit too much loft, at impact. So a wood generates more ball speed compared to an iron. So something with more ball speed coming off the face faster, more club head speed. Essentially, with that delivery, if that spin rate jumps up, that ball is going to go sky high, and there's no control over that golf ball whatsoever. Someone like John may fall into that category. And you look at then some of the best players in the world that are using these higher lofted woods, at impact. I think we touched on it earlier as well. With some, especially going back to the iron sets, if they're using traditional lofted iron sets where they've got 7 iron at 34 degrees, they aren't spinning that 7 iron up. So there's something happening there at impact where they are presenting the correct amount of loft, if not de-lofting it. So if anything, they're trying to find spin. And especially with the woods now, with some of the golf courses they're playing that are 7,500 yards plus, to get something launching high, landing soft at those yardages where they might need to find that distance, something like a 5 wood, a 7 wood, a 9 wood, because they're presenting the correct amount of loft at impact, and de-lofting that club actually suits them perfectly, because they get the launch, they get the spin, and they get the stopping power. Other players can be sort of the total opposite. So at impact, expose a hell of a lot of loft. So it's, potentially that combination then of faster ball speeds is potentially not the best option.
Yeah, and it comes down to kind of like the situation, right? It is like if you've got somebody who hasn't got a huge amount of ball speed, and they might need to get the ball in the air, they need launch, or they need a bit of speed. Like a 7 wood, 9 wood all day long in the bag is going to perform better than a long iron, without question. But when you relate it to someone like John, who's probably got a bit of ball speed, I would imagine, could be wrong, but I would assume he's got a bit of ball speed. It'd be interesting to understand kind of like what irons he uses as well, whether he's using kind of like a traditional lofted set of irons, or whether he's got something like a T150 or a P770 or a P790, or even if he's de-lofted some of his irons, whatever it would be. But I think there's 2 things which you need in order to play some of these woods. If you've got ball speed, you either need a low spin rate or a low launch angle. And if you haven't got either of those, they're probably not going to work. Unless you like seeing that golf ball going up in the air like a huge amount, they're probably not going to work. So the reason why I mentioned launch angle there is because when you've got a low launch angle, you need spin, right? So I can relate to this with a player that I've worked with recently. Spins the ball loads with, or spins the ball like higher than what you would expect with most clubs, but it's got a mid to low launch angle, so he kind of needs the spin. And anytime that you try something then which gives you the correct spin with low launch angle or a lower launch angle, that ball just ain't stopping. So the spin then helps all of a sudden. So I would imagine if John hits these clubs really high, either his perception of high is wrong, which probably not. He's got either a shallow attack angle, which is making that ball launch up in the air too much, or he's delivering a little bit too much loft, which is making that ball spin a little bit. And I would imagine that out of those 3, really, one of those is going to be applicable. So for John, if he's tuning in and listening, you've got 2 options. You either change delivery, which is hard work, and probably going to take a while, or you sack off a 7 wood, you sack off a 5 wood and a 9 wood idea. You just get a really good long iron, or like even look at something like the Callaway Apex utility woods. They're really good options because they kind of almost bridge that gap really in between like a 5 wood and a hybrid. They don't spin up too much. or just stick a 2-iron in there. I mean, the utility irons these days, they're so easy to hit.
Yeah.
You know, they get up in the air, they don't spin that much, they're forgiving. So there's lots of good options out there to fill that gap. But really, really good question.
Absolutely. There's probably like a couple of hybrids out there as well, I think, that potentially sort of fit that gap.
Yeah. He said he's tried hybrids, so I don't know kind of where he's kind of gone wrong with the hybrids. But
Sure.
but yeah, I would imagine something like a 2-iron. And if those don't work then, and you can't really solve the problem effectively with equipment, it's probably a good time to, you know, start digging into kind of like your numbers a little bit, your delivery numbers, and see where that's going wrong, and seeing why you can't go into a 5-wood or a 7-wood, or perhaps why a 2-iron doesn't work so much. And perhaps it would be time to have a look at a technique a little bit. But I hope that helps anyway for John. We've got another good question as well.
Hi Tom, how's it going? As you well know, I love talking about new kit and testing new kit. I especially like a nice shaft. So, my question to you is, what is the difference between your stock shafts off the shelf and your high-end stuff, your handcrafted or your small batch shafts? How much build quality difference is there? And is it really worth it?
Good question.
Very good question.
I love this. I absolutely love it. And we could start you in a million different ways, and we could go down a massive rabbit hole on this. But I want to make sure that we keep it fairly simple for Pete and anybody else that's interested in this kind of topic. First of all, Matt, have you got any kind of like headline kind of statements on what you think about that question? You know, high-end shafts versus the stuff we sell stock shafts, day in day out.
100%.
Do they work? Yes, they work, and we get good results with them. But what do you think?
Again, very hot topic. It's a question that's asked a lot, and especially because we carry quite a few of them. You know, and the conversation always comes up: what am I going to gain from going for an upcharge shaft or an aftermarket shaft? You know, if you sort of unpick it then and you go into sort of how these shafts are made and what the process is behind that, I think that the key word for it is tolerance. And not only with woods, with iron shafts.
We had a good conversation the other day about the dynamic gold tour issues.
Yeah, 100%. And it's the tolerance and how precise they are in the production of these shafts compared to, not some of the other shafts. They're all built to a very good standard, but I think it's just that little bit more. But again,
I think as well, kind of like graphite shafts now compared to 15, 20 years ago, they're a different gravy, and probably what you're seeing in the stock shafts these days are stuff that you would have seen as an upcharge, and the after classes aftermarket probably 10, 15 years ago as an example. I don't know that for definite, but I would have thought that the production and everything when it comes to being able to produce something at a more tighter tolerance would have improved over the course of 15, 20 years.
There's a couple of manufacturers now that are offering like even stuff like the 1K carbon in tensile shafts. So again, previously that was more of what we deemed as an aftermarket shaft, and now they moved it into their sort of standard matrix, which is good to see.
Yeah.
Really, really
so there's clearly a difference here, right? Because you've got one shaft which effectively doesn't cost you anything when you buy a golf club. It does cost you something because it's all built into the price.
Sure.
But then there's another option then which sometimes even looks the same, and you can bang on another 200-300 quid. So there's got to be a difference there, right? And there's a reason why there's an upcharge. And I think the biggest problem here is kind of what I alluded to just now, is often a lot of them look the same because they're painted in the same way. And when you see somebody like Tiger using a tensile orange shaft, and then you pick up a ping driver, which on the surface of it has got a little orange band in the middle of it, it's like, oh, that looks like the same one as what Tiger's using. And that's the reason why they all look very, very similar. I think if you were to strip the paint back and you were to start analysing kind of like the grade of the carbon. So carbon is graded by a term called ton, right? And the quality of the carbon is going to change as you start going into these aftermarket shafts, right? And obviously you don't see that when you're looking at these fancy paint jobs on the outside. So like you say, the tolerances are tighter. And there's a term with shaft manufacturing called ovalization, right? And effectively, when you swing a golf club, what you're looking to do is trying to keep that shaft as round as possible. And you're trying to minimize how much that shaft kind of like stretches and effectively ovalizes. So when you start using these higher grade shafts, and then you start, rolling them by hand as an example, where you could got more control over it, you're not able to kind of produce as many. The tolerances are tighter, the manufacturing processes are better, and they are much better shafts. But what it comes down to is whether it's going to make a difference. And I think that's kind of like what Pete is really is trying to ask here. Personally speaking, I've been very lucky where, in past jobs where I've had access to pretty much, all of the aftermarket shafts. Every time I built a club, it's just automatic. You just go for these shafts. Now, when I go into a standard production shaft, to me it feels different, right? It feels like it kind of like moves around a little bit more. But you're talking to someone who's probably only ever used aftermarket shafts for the last 10 or 15 years. So I feel like it's different. And personally, I would be one who would always go for an aftermarket shaft. However, the type of client that we get through the door, day in, day out, often they come to us with a bit of a budget. And it's not to say that you're going to get a terrible golf club by going into a stock shaft. I mean, like I said earlier, you get lots and lots of customers, and I get lots of customers who do great jobs for, and the numbers are fantastic by using some of these stock shafts. And they're still good. It's not like they're absolute garbage. But when you start comparing an aftermarket to a stock shaft, there's big differences there. And I think, is it the type of thing that's going to revolutionize your game? Maybe not. Is it the type of thing that is going to cross the T's and dot the I's? Definitely. Is it an expensive thing to do to cross the T's and dot the I's? Yes. Like all of a sudden you get driver 3 wood, 5 wood, and you start bunging in 3 aftermarket shafts there. It's an expensive couple of clubs, or 3 clubs. So I think what it's worth doing is kind of weighing up things and looking at it. And I always think that, is an aftermarket shaft going to be a low-hanging fruit for you? Is that something which is going to make a big difference? Or is something like, and this is completely off topic, is something like investing in a stats package and being able to analyze your golf after every round and optimize your practice and being able to kind of go, right, I've got 2 hours a week. I've looked at my stats from the weekend. My short game is rubbish, or my pitching is rubbish, or my putting is rubbish. I'm going to spend 2 hours there. Or do you want to spend 300 quid on a driver shaft, which doesn't really address the areas of your game really, or the things you need to improve? I don't know. But also on the flip side, if your driving is really bad, the first thing I would do is I'd have a look at your delivery. If you're cutting across it by 12 degrees and the face is 10 degrees open, I'm pretty certain an aftermarket shaft is not going to make much of a difference. It might make a little tiny difference, but it's not going to go, it's not going to make you go from a 30-yard curve shot which goes from left to right, which is below optimal, to something which is a nice high draw, which is optimal. So I think it's really important to kind of to look at it a little bit more holistically, and then go, right, okay, is this extra tolerance, the higher grade carbon, the ovalization, the less ovalization, all these other things which come with aftermarket shafts, is that going to be a really good investment for me? And I think for most people that we see anyway, and this is probably going to be quite controversial, I would probably say no. They don't necessarily need to spend that money in order to improve their game as a whole. Would it improve their driving a little bit? Probably. Every person, it would probably improve their driving a little bit. But I guess it's just weighing up then that cost versus the outcome. and then looking at your game overall and thinking, is there other areas that I can improve? What do you think of that?
Yeah, 100%. I was gonna come back to you there with a question actually.
Go on then.
For yourself. And apologies if this doesn't really make sense. In my head, it does.
Okay.
So in terms of like aftermarket shafts now, and you say there probably would be an improvement, like I said, in just crossing the T's and dotting the I's with players. What measurable parameter do you think has the biggest sort of influence on? And not when I say improve, I mean stabilize or optimize. So when I say measurable, I'm talking spin rates.
This is a really, really good question, and this is why, you're right, this area is so controversial. It's just really hard to quantify because it's the same as if I give you a Callaway driver and I give you a TaylorMade driver and I give you a Titleist driver and you hit the Titleist driver miles better. How the hell do we know that Titleist driver, you haven't just put 6 really good swings on it, and the TaylorMade driver, that you've actually delivered it not as good, right? And this is why it's so controversial and really difficult to kind of nail down whether it is actually will make a difference or not. But I think when it comes to probably face control is the one, right? Which if you could put it on a robot and you could just move that strike across the face a little bit, I think that you would see a difference in face control, with the twisting and the torquing of the shafts. Yeah. That's going to be different. The off-center strikes are probably going to be a little bit different. But in terms of quantifying that, it's very, very, very difficult, borderline impossible to quantify that. Which is why it's such a subjective subject. Yeah, 100%.
So I think Fujikura, the Ventus shafts, like that's a very popular one at the minute. That Velocore technology, it's stability, isn't it?
Yeah.
In sort of that club face, and compared to their non-Velocore shaft, what that offers, it's that they play on that word stability. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, but I think also if we swapped out every standard Ventus shaft that we sold over the last 2 years and we put Velocores in and we charged everybody another 250, 300 quid, are we going to get people coming back in? And if we just done it with driver, are we going to get people coming back in saying, I either want to make sure that I always go into aftermarket shafts, or can I have this aftermarket shaft in my 3-wood and 5-wood? Do you think that would be the case?
No.
I'm not sure either. I'm not sure. Because the bad shots are still going to exist. But I think in terms of crossing the T's, dotting the I's, if you want to be super anal, super analytical about your equipment, do it. If you've not got any budget constraints, do it. It's the same as puring, right? Puring the shafts, controversial subject. But it's a crossing the T's, it's a dot in the I thing. Is it going to make a massive difference? Probably not. Is it worth doing? Probably. If you've got 20, 25 quid per club to throw at it, you have 7 clubs, all of a sudden you're adding on a couple of hundred quid to the cost of your clubs. Is it worth it? I've never had my clubs pured, have you? And I've had some pretty good golf clubs, and I can assure you, like all of the clubs that we used to build on the European Tour track, none of them used to get pured. So we had lots of winners come from that track, But again, crossing the T's, is it going to hurt? No. How much is it going to help is a question which is really hard to quantify. Sure. So good, interesting chat there. 2
good hot topics, I think, on those questions.
Yeah.
Like very current topics.
But also as well, I think it's quite difficult to get to a real clinical answer there. Yeah. And I think, like I say, they are better. There's no question they are better. The biggest question, which is the hardest one to answer, is it worth it? And when you look at it as a player, I think, is it worth it? If you're just looking at it, is it going to make my driver better? And that is the only context of that question. And you haven't got an issue with budget, do it. No question. Just do it. Find somewhere that's got a huge amount of them to test and go and test them and do it. If the question is, how do I make my whole game better? Then you need to find a way of analysing your whole game and seeing if driving is actually the bit that's holding you back, and whether you need to push more resources into that area, I would say. So hopefully that makes sense to Pete, and thank you to John as well, who sent in the questions.
Absolutely.
Have you got anything else that you want to go over, Matt? Anything you think that we've missed?
No, I think we've had a good chat there.
Yeah,
I think we've covered some some good stuff.
Yeah, we'll talk about irons next time.
Cool.
We'll have a little talk about irons. So anybody that's got questions on irons, we'll talk about some of the stuff that we've got in our bags as well.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really go over our wedges either, but
No.
it's a bit late in the day to go over that now. So fingers crossed that's valuable to everybody. Like we always say, if anybody's got any questions, comments on YouTube, Instagram direct message, send us a WhatsApp as well. Ideally, we'd love it in voice note form so we can play it during the podcast like everybody would have listened to already. It sounds great, really interactive. And if there's nothing else, over and out.
See you next week.